Picture a courtroom where the accused isn't a person, a thief, or even an animal, but a shadow, a silent, intangible darkness standing trial, as if it had a will of its own. This wasn't the plot of a fantasy novel or a bizarre dream. It was real. In one corner of medieval Europe, an entire kingdom became so consumed by superstition that they dragged shadows into court, charging them with crimes and sentencing them as if they were living, breathing culprits. How did this happen? What kind of world feared shadows so deeply that they needed to be arrested and judged? This is the story of a time when logic took a backseat to fear, when folklore and paranoia twisted the very foundations of justice. Imagine living in a place where every flicker of darkness could be seen as a threat, where the unseen was treated as dangerously as the seen. The kingdom's courts didn't just punish people, they put shadows on trial, complete with witnesses, verdicts, and even punishments. It sounds unbelievable, but history is full of moments where human imagination and sometimes sheer panic reshaped reality in ways that now seem absurd. Today, we're diving into this extraordinary chapter of medieval life, unraveling the beliefs that made shadows into criminals and the legal system that humored such fears. What drove a society to this extreme? Was it a desperate need for control in an unpredictable world, a way to explain the unexplainable, or simply the power of superstition run wild? By the end of this journey, you'll see how deeply fear can warp justice, and how the line between myth and law wasn't just crossed but erased entirely. So settle in, because what you're about to discover is stranger than fiction. To grasp why an entire kingdom saw shadows as criminals, we have to step into the medieval mind, a place where the line between the natural and supernatural was blurry at best. In a world lit only by flickering candlelight and hearth fires, shadows weren't just absences of light, they were living mysteries. People believed darkness could harbor spirits, demons, or even fragments of a person's soul. A shadow moving unexpectedly wasn't just a trick of the light. It was a sign, a warning, or worse, an active threat. This fear wasn't born in a vacuum. Ancient folklore across Europe whispered of shadows as omens, ghostly figures predicting death, or invisible hands causing crops to fail. Some thought a detached shadow meant a stolen soul, while others saw them as doorways for evil forces. By the Middle Ages, these superstitions had hardened into something darker, the idea that shadows could act with malicious intent. If a barn burned down mysteriously, or a child fell ill with no explanation, a shadow might be blamed just as easily as a human arsonist or poisoner. Religion fed these fears too. The medieval church taught that evil lurked everywhere, and shadows, those ever-present fragments of darkness, became perfect scapegoats. In a society desperate to explain misfortune, putting shadows on trial wasn't absurd, it was logical. If darkness could be held accountable, then justice could be served and order restored. So courtrooms adapted. Witnesses testified against shadows they swore had attacked or cursed them. Judges solemnly listened, weighing evidence as if prosecuting a visible defendant. What's most revealing isn't just that these trials happened, it's why they kept happening. Every conviction reinforced the belief. If a shadow was found guilty and punished, perhaps by being symbolically banished or destroyed, and the misfortune stopped, it seemed like proof the system worked. Fear, once baked into law, becomes very hard to undo. And so, in this kingdom, shadows remained on trial for generations, not because the evidence was sound, but because the alternative, admitting the unknown couldn't be controlled, was far more terrifying. What set this kingdom apart wasn't just superstition. It was a legal system that codified fear into law. While other medieval societies might have whispered about shadowy omens or blamed misfortune on spirits, this kingdom went further. Their legal texts didn't just acknowledge shadows as potential nuisances, they branded them as agents of chaos, granting them the same legal status as human criminals. Surviving manuscripts reveal meticulous statutes outlining how shadows could be arrested, tried, and even sentenced, complete with prescribed punishments. In one remarkable case from the year 1327, a shadow was formally accused of stealing the light from a church candle during midnight mass, leaving worshippers in darkness. Witnesses swore under oath they'd seen the shadow creep across the altar before the flame mysteriously died. The court's verdict, guilty, with the offending shadow banished from the church by the symbolic lighting of a dozen new candles. These trials weren't rare outliers, they were routine. Court records detail shadows charged with everything from vandalism, like one blamed for causing a wine barrel to crack by looming over it, to more serious offenses. In the town of Briarwood, a shadow was even held responsible for a miller's broken arm after witnesses claimed it tripped him by suddenly lengthening across his path. What's striking isn't just the absurdity of the charges, but the solemnity with which they were treated. Judges demanded evidence, heard testimony, and deliberated as if weighing the fate of a flesh and blood defendant. The kingdom's legal obsession with shadows reveals a deeper truth. When fear becomes law, rationality doesn't stand a chance. Unlike neighboring realms where folk beliefs stayed in the realm of gossip or priestly warnings, here superstition was given the full force of the state. By writing shadows into the legal code, the kingdom's rulers transformed vague dread into something tangible, a system where chaos could be controlled through courtroom rituals. It offered the illusion of order in a world full of uncertainties. If a shadow could be convicted and punished, then misfortune wasn't random, it was a solvable crime. Yet this legal framework also exposed a paradox. The very act of prosecuting shadows required acknowledging their power, effectively giving darkness a kind of agency. In trying to tame superstition, the law ended up legitimizing it. Every trial reinforced the idea that shadows were capable of malice, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear. And so, for generations, the kingdom's courts remained busy prosecuting the one defendant that could never speak in its own defense, a silence that only made the shadows seem more guilty. The nobleman stood in the courtroom, not pointing at an enemy or a rival, but at the dark shape stretching across the floor beside him, his own shadow. According to the trial records from the year 1289, Lord Aldrich of Blackvale became convinced his shadow was plotting against him, moving independently to sabotage his reputation. Servants testified under oath that they'd seen the shadow slink behind tapestries or linger near documents that later went missing. The court, with solemn gravity, treated these claims as credible evidence. No one questioned how a shadow could conspire without a mind or body. No one demanded proof beyond eerie coincidences and frightened whispers. After days of deliberation, the judges reached their verdict, guilty. The sentence, Lord Aldrich's shadow was banished from sunlight, an impossible decree enforced by ordering the nobleman to stay indoors for 40 days. This trial wasn't just bizarre, it was groundbreaking. For the first time, a shadow had been formally recognized as a legal entity capable of crime. The precedent spread like wildfire. Within months, similar cases popped up across the kingdom. A farmer accusing his shadow of hexing his livestock, a priest charging one with defiling holy ground by appearing too long during prayers. Each prosecution reinforced the idea that shadows weren't just symbols of evil, but active perpetrators. What's chilling isn't the absurdity of these trials, but how easily authority legitimized them. Judges, often educated men versed in law, didn't dismiss the cases as nonsense. Instead, they applied legal reasoning to superstition, treating shadows as defendants with rights or lack thereof. The courtroom's ritualistic gravity lent credibility to the farce. Witnesses swore oaths on Bibles, scribes recorded testimonies, and verdicts were sealed with wax and ceremony. By dressing fear in the trappings of justice, the kingdom made the irrational seem lawful. This phenomenon reveals an uncomfortable truth about power and belief. When those in authority validate collective fears, even the wildest ideas can become institutionalized. The shadow trials didn't persist because people genuinely thought darkness could scheme. They persisted because the alternative, admitting the court's rulings were meaningless, would have undermined the entire system. Better to blame a shadow than to face a world where misfortune had no culprit at all. And so the farce continued, not despite its absurdity, but because of it. The trials became a theatrical release valve for societal anxiety, a way to punish the intangible horrors that couldn't be fought with swords or locks. Yet the legacy of Lord Aldrich's case goes deeper. It shows how easily authority can weaponize imagination, turning folklore into law. Once the courts accepted that shadows could be guilty, the door opened for anything unseen: whispers, dreams, even the wind to be next. The trials weren't really about shadows at all. They were about control. In a world where darkness could be put in the dock, no one had to admit that sometimes bad things just happen. The townspeople gathered in the square, their faces flickering between awe and disbelief as the bailiff dragged a stained canvas across the cobblestones, the accused shadow pinned like a captured beast. Public reactions to these trials split the kingdom in two. For some, watching a shadow stand trial was the height of justice, a sacred ritual to purge evil from their midst. A chronicle from the village of Elmwick describes women crossing themselves as a shadow was convicted of blighting a harvest, sighing with relief when the judge ordered it bound by chalk circles. To them, this wasn't theater, it was survival. If a shadow could be blamed for misfortune, then misfortune could be defeated. But not everyone bought into the spectacle. Travelers' journals and tavern songs from the era mock the trials as judges chasing darkness with parchment and ink. One particularly scathing ballad, The Lay of the Doomed Shadow, recounts a trial where the defendant, a patch of dusk on a tavern wall, was sentenced to be burned at dawn. The crowd erupted in laughter when the executioner tried to light the wall on fire. Satire became a quiet rebellion. Mock trials sprang up in marketplaces where children tried their own shadows for crimes like stealing their footprints. Yet even the skeptics rarely spoke out openly. Disrespecting the trials meant disrespecting the law and the church, which often endorsed them. A merchant's diary from 1402 confesses, "I keep my laughter behind my teeth when the bailiff swears a shadow tripped him." But who am I to call it madness when the bishop nods along? This tension between private doubt and public compliance shows how deeply power shaped belief. The trials didn't just reflect superstition, they enforced it. The poorest citizens, though, had the most complicated relationship with the farce. Many saw the trials as a grim joke, yet still brought cases forward. Why? Because accusing a shadow was safer than accusing a neighbor. If your well dried up, blaming a shadow spared you from feuds with the local lord or the miller. The trials became a twisted sort of social pressure valve, redirecting blame onto something that couldn't fight back. What's most revealing is how these reactions mirrored the kingdom's fractures. The elite used the trials to showcase their piety and control. The desperate used them as shields, and the disillusioned, they whispered jokes in the dark, where no one could see their smiles, proving that even in a kingdom that feared shadows, not everyone was afraid to laugh. The church's stance on shadow trials was anything but unified, a quiet war of belief waged in sermons and scribbled margins. On one side stood priests like Bishop Arnulf of Vexley, who thundered from the pulpit that shadows were God's design, not devils to be tried. In a fiery letter from 1351, he mocked the courts for chasing darkness like dogs barking at the moon, arguing that only pagan minds would blame misfortune on something as natural as a shadow. Yet across the kingdom, other clergy disagreed. Abbot Gerard of the monastery of St. Elwin penned a now infamous treatise claiming shadows could indeed be vessels of corruption, citing the biblical plague of darkness in Egypt as proof that God himself used shadows as instruments of punishment. This split wasn't just theological nitpicking, it mirrored a deeper struggle in medieval Christianity. The Church had long wrestled with how to handle folk beliefs that refused to die. Were shadows part of God's creation, or remnants of older, darker superstitions that needed purging? Some priests saw the trials as a dangerous return to animism, where every tree and stream had a spirit. Others, though, embraced them as a way to Christianize fear. By bringing shadows into court, they argued, the kingdom was submitting even the unseen to divine law. One parish record from 1412 describes a trial where a shadow was exorcised rather than sentenced, blending legal and religious ritual into something entirely new. What's most revealing is how local communities used this ambiguity to their advantage. In towns where the church opposed the trials, accusers began framing their claims in religious terms. A shadow accused of spoiling milk wasn't just malicious, it was Satan's work, requiring clerical intervention. Meanwhile, villages with superstitious priests turned courtrooms into makeshift churches, hanging crosses above the defendant's empty space. The trials became a bizarre negotiation between faith and folklore, where the lines between sin and superstition blurred beyond recognition. Yet the church's divided stance had consequences. When a bishop in Ravensbrück declared shadows innocent of all but God's will, his own congregation revolted, accusing him of siding with the darkness. The resulting riots left the church's stained glass windows shattered ironically, casting new shadows across the pews. It was a stark reminder, in a kingdom that feared the unseen, even the church couldn't dictate what darkness meant. Whether condemned or blessed, shadow trials endured not because the church willed it, but because people needed them to, a testament to how deeply fear could outlast doctrine. The most insidious shadow trials weren't about superstition at all, they were about power. Behind the absurd spectacle of prosecuting darkness lay a chilling political strategy. Accusing someone's shadow became the perfect way to ruin them without ever mentioning their name. Take the case of Sir Gareth of Thornbrook, a knight who fell afoul of King Alaric III in 1342. When Gareth began rallying support against unfair taxes, the king's magistrates didn't arrest him outright. Instead, they charged his shadow with conspiring against the crown's light, presenting evidence that it had darkened the throne's steps during an audience. The trial was a masterstroke of intimidation. Gareth wasn't punished directly, but his reputation crumbled as crowds whispered that even his shadow betrayed treasonous intent. Within months, his allies abandoned him, and his lands were quietly redistributed to loyal nobles. This wasn't an isolated incident. Court records from the period reveal a pattern. Shadows of outspoken merchants, rebellious clergy, and rival nobles suddenly became criminals at suspiciously convenient times. The genius of the scheme was its deniability. By targeting shadows, accusers could plausibly claim they weren't attacking people, just purifying the kingdom of malevolent forces. A lord wanting to seize a neighbor's fertile valley might notice how the rival's shadow blighted the crops. A bishop coveting a monastery's relics could declare its shadows heretical for defiling sacred walls. The accused couldn't even defend themselves because technically they weren't the ones on trial. Their shadows were, and shadows, of course, couldn't testify. The trials also served as psychological warfare. Imagine the paranoia of living in a court where your own silhouette might be used against you. Noble households began employing shadow attendants to discreetly adjust candle placements, ensuring their masters' shadows never fell suspiciously across the king's path. Some even practiced standing at precise angles during audiences, turning their bodies like sundials to avoid accusations. The wealthiest commissioned shadow portraits, paintings proving their shadows behaved loyally on specific dates. It was a grotesque dance of self-preservation, where the elite policed their own darkness to survive. What made these political trials so effective was their veneer of legitimacy. Unlike outright executions or confiscations, shadow prosecutions followed legal procedures, complete with witnesses and verdicts. When foreign diplomats questioned the practice, royal scholars pointed to ancient texts, proving shadows could harbor intent. The church's divided stance only helped. Accusers could always find a sympathetic priest to declare a shadow sin-stained. By the 15th century, the tactic had grown so refined that shadow accusations followed a hidden code. A dancing shadow implied frivolity unfit for office. A still one suggested plotting, and a shadow that fled light was practically a confession of guilt. Yet the cruelest twist was how the system trapped even its architects. King Alaric himself eventually faced a shadow trial after his chancellor, eager to replace him, convinced the court that the royal shadow grew too long at noon, a clear sign of hunger for power. The king who'd weaponized shadows died in exile, his own silhouette condemned as a usurper of the sun. It was a fitting end to a practice that turned the law into a hall of mirrors where no one, not even the accusers, could escape their own darkness. Medieval scholars staring into candlelight saw shadows not as science, but as riddles written by unseen hands. To them, darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a living, shifting entity with motives of its own. The most educated minds of the era theorized shadows were everything from condensed air to traces of the soul left behind. One 14th century treatise, the Book of Shadows, claimed they were the fingerprints of angels and demons wrestling over earthly souls. Even when thinkers like Robert Grosseteste proposed that shadows followed geometric rules, their ideas were drowned out by older, darker superstitions. The church's teachings didn't help. Many priests taught that shadows grew longer at dusk because evil walked closer to the world when the sun fled, a belief that made every stretching twilight silhouette seem like a threat. This wasn't just ignorance, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of cause and effect. When a shadow crossed a sick child's cradle and the child later died, medieval logic saw malice, not coincidence. Scholars who dared suggest shadows were mere byproducts of light blocking were accused of denying the divine order. A chilling example survives in the trial notes of Friar Matthias, a monk who argued shadows couldn't curse crops because they had no substance. His own abbey charged him with heresy, forcing him to publicly recant by holding a candle to his shadow and commanding it to confess its sins. The spectacle silenced dissent for decades. Enter Leonardo da Vinci, centuries later, sketching shadows with a precision that bordered on obsession. His notebooks overflow with studies of how light draped over shoulders or pooled in folds of fabric, proof that shadows obeyed predictable laws. Had the kingdom's courts listened, they might have seen the absurdity of prosecuting darkness, but dogma outshone reason. When Leonardo's diagrams reached the Royal Academy, scholars dismissed them as playthings of a Florentine dreamer. The law required shadows to be capricious because if they weren't, the entire edifice of shadow trials crumbled. The tragedy lies in what they missed. While medieval courts wasted ink condemning silhouettes, early scientists like Alhazen in the Islamic world were already unraveling light's secrets, proving shadows were nothing more than geometry in action. By the time Galileo's telescopes turned eyes skyward, Europe had centuries of legal records prosecuting figments of darkness, a stark reminder of how fear distorts truth. The kingdom's scholars weren't stupid, they were trapped. To admit shadows were harmless meant admitting generations of verdicts were farcical, that justice had been a performance all along. And so the trials endured, not because the evidence was sound, but because the alternative confronting their own ignorance was a shadow too terrifying to face. Among the kingdom's most infamous shadow trials, none captured the public imagination like the case of the shadow of the broken tower. In the summer of 1384, the eastern wing of Castle Brinthar crumbled without warning, burying 12 servants under rubble. Panic spread like wildfire until a guardsman claimed he'd seen a slithering blackness coil around the tower's base moments before the collapse. By sundown, the castle's shadow was in the dock, accused of sapping the strength of stone. Witnesses swore it had grown teeth or pulsed like a living thing in the days before the disaster. The trial lasted a fortnight, with architects and masons testifying that no flaw in the mortar could explain the collapse. The verdict was inevitable. The shadow was declared a corrupter of foundations and sentenced to eternal banishment from the sun. Workers spent weeks whitewashing the castle's remaining walls to purge its darkness, a futile gesture that somehow satisfied the crowd. But the broken tower's shadow wasn't alone in its notoriety. In the coastal town of Marisport, fishermen blamed a wandering shadow for sinking ships by clinging to their hulls like a barnacle of doom. Locals claimed it moved against the wind, sliding across the waves to target vessels. When 3 boats vanished in a storm, the shadow was tried in absentia, despite no one agreeing which shadow was guilty. The court solved this by condemning every shadow along the harbor at high tide, ordering lanterns hung from every mast to imprison darkness at sea. Sailors grudgingly complied, though tavern songs later mocked the decree with lines like, "The waves took our men, but oh, what a sight, to see judges scold the absence of light." Then there was the case of the weeping shadow in the village of Elmsford. After a drought withered their crops, farmers accused a shadow cast by the old gallows of drinking the rain. They dragged the gallows itself to court, arguing its shadow had grown fat on their suffering. The trial took a surreal turn when the local miller's daughter, known for her sightless visions, testified the shadow had whispered to her in the voice of hanged men. The judges, torn between horror and spectacle, ordered the gallows painted white only for the villagers to riot when the next rainstorm also failed. The real twist: records show the drought broke a week later, cementing the belief that the shadow's execution had worked. What makes these cases so haunting isn't just their absurdity, it's how they mirror real human tragedies. The broken tower's shadow trial distracted from the Lord's neglect of repairs. The Marisport verdict shifted blame from shoddy shipbuilding and the weeping shadow. A convenient scapegoat for failed harvests that likely stemmed from overfarmed soil. These shadows became vessels for grief and guilt, their crimes absolving living hands of responsibility. Yet some trials tipped into pure theater. In the city of Larkspur, a baker's shadow was charged with stealing the sweetness from his pastries after rivals spread rumors. The court executed it by having the baker stand in a barrel of flour at noon, rendering him momentarily shadowless, a stunt so popular it spawned a yearly festival where children tried their shadows for mock offenses. Here, the farce was the point. By turning fear into ritual, people could laugh at what once terrified them. These stories endure because they're more than legal oddities, they're parables about how easily societies invent monsters to explain their misfortunes. Every condemned shadow hid a truth too uncomfortable to name, that towers fall from poor craftsmanship, ships sink to storms, and crops fail from human error. The kingdom didn't just prosecute shadows, it weaponized them, turning darkness into the perfect defendant, silent, ever-present, and incapable of denial. By the dawn of the 17th century, the kingdom's shadow trials began to unravel, not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping doubt. The first cracks appeared not in the courts, but in the streets, where a new generation of thinkers whispered questions their grandparents would have called blasphemy. If shadows could be guilty, why did they never flee justice? Why did no shadow ever confess under interrogation? The answers, when they came, didn't just end the trials, they exposed the fragile logic that had sustained them for centuries. Science was the silent executioner. As Renaissance scholars rediscovered the works of ancient opticians like Euclid and Ptolemy, the idea that shadows obeyed predictable laws became harder to ignore. A traveling lecturer in 1592 caused a scandal by demonstrating with prisms and lenses that shadows weren't beings at all, but mere absences of light, as punishable as a hole in a bucket. The church initially condemned these demonstrations, but even priests couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. When Galileo's telescopes turned toward the heavens in the early 1600s, revealing celestial shadows cast by mountains on the moon, the old superstitions faced their hardest truth yet. If shadows in the sky were natural, why not those on Earth? The legal world, too, began to shift. A young judge named Matthias von Alder penned a scathing critique in 1605, arguing that shadow trials violated the very principles of justice. A defendant without a voice, he wrote, is a trial without truth. His words struck a chord among reformists who saw the trials as relics of a credulous past. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter, the kingdom's merchants. As trade grew, so did frustration with foreign merchants who mocked the shadow courts as barbaric. When the wealthy wool guild threatened to move its operations to a land not ruled by phantoms, the crown took notice. The last recorded shadow trial occurred in 1624 in the sleepy village of Hargrove. A farmer accused his neighbor's shadow of withering his apple trees, but this time something remarkable happened. The local magistrate, a man educated in Leyden, dismissed the case with a sigh, declaring, "If darkness is a crime, then night itself must hang." The crowd, expecting the usual spectacle, erupted in uneasy laughter. No one appealed the verdict, no riot demanded justice. The trial ended not with a sentencing, but with a collective shrug. Yet the trials didn't vanish overnight. Like shadows at dusk, they lingered at the edges of society. Old women still spat at cursed silhouettes, and rural judges occasionally humored the occasional shadow complaint well into the 1700s. But the age of official prosecutions was over. What killed them wasn't just reason or ridicule, but something simpler, the unbearable weight of their own absurdity. In the end, the kingdom didn't reject shadow trials because they were irrational. It rejected them because pretending they made sense had grown exhausting. The legacy of these trials, though, stretches far beyond their absurdity. They stand as a warning of how easily fear can dress itself in the robes of law, and how hard it is to undo beliefs once they're woven into the fabric of power. Long after the last shadow was acquitted, the kingdom's courts still struggled with cases where emotion outweighed evidence, a reminder that while prosecuting darkness may seem laughable now, the instincts that fueled it never truly disappear. The trials ended not because humanity outgrew superstition, but because we learned, however slowly, to fear the real monsters more, our own capacity to believe the unbelievable. The human mind has always been a battlefield between the seen and the unseen, where even the most ordinary things can become terrifying when fear takes the reins. Shadows, those fleeting companions of light, became monsters in the medieval imagination, not because they were inherently frightening, but because fear itself rewired how people saw them. Psychologists call this phenomenon pareidolia, the instinct to find patterns where none exist, like seeing faces in clouds or hearing whispers in the wind. For the kingdom that tried shadows, this tendency spiraled into something darker. When a shadow flickered unexpectedly, it wasn't just a trick of the light, it was a sign, a warning, or the first flicker of an unseen threat. This wasn't mere superstition, it was survival logic gone haywire. Our brains are hardwired to detect danger, even when there isn't any. In a world where wolves lurked in forests and plagues struck without warning, assuming the worst could mean the difference between life and death. Shadows, always present yet never fully understood, became perfect vessels for that paranoia. Dr. Elena Voss, a historian of medieval psychology, explains it like this: when you live in perpetual uncertainty, your mind fills the gaps. A shadow moving oddly isn't just strange, it's intentional. That leap from coincidence to conspiracy is how collective delusions take root. The kingdom's fear of shadows also taps into something deeper, the human need to personify the unknown. We've always given names and motives to forces we can't control. Storms become gods, diseases become curses. Shadows were no different. By accusing them of malice, people transformed random misfortune into something with rules, something that could be defeated. A scholar from the University of Oxford describes this as the courtroom as theatre, where putting shadows on trial was less about justice and more about restoring the illusion of control. If a shadow could be banished and the harvest improved, then the world wasn't chaotic, just unfairly balanced. But perhaps the most chilling insight comes from modern studies on mass hysteria. Historians point to cases like the Salem witch trials or the dancing plagues of the Renaissance, where entire communities became convinced of impossible threats. The shadow trials fit the same pattern. Once enough people believed, doubters stayed silent. No peasant would argue that shadows were harmless when their neighbors saw them as criminals. Fear, when shared, becomes its own kind of truth. What's haunting isn't that people feared shadows, it's how easily that fear became law. The trials didn't start because shadows were dangerous. They started because blaming them was easier than admitting how little control anyone really had. And once the courts agreed, the delusion became unstoppable. In the end, the kingdom wasn't just prosecuting darkness, it was revealing how fragile human reason can be when faced with the unknown. The real horror wasn't the shadows at all. It was what they showed us about ourselves. If prosecuting shadows seems like the height of medieval absurdity, brace yourself, history's courtroom dramas got even stranger. Across Europe, animals, objects, and even the dead stood trial, convicted of crimes with the same solemnity as human defendants. In the Swiss town of Basel, a rooster was burned at the stake in 1474 for the unnatural crime of laying an egg, a feat the townsfolk believed could only be the work of Satan. Over in France, a sow and her piglets were dressed in human clothes and hanged for allegedly murdering a child. And in the Italian city of Ravenna, church bells weren't just rung, they were excommunicated for ringing without permission during a papal visit. These trials weren't outliers, they were part of a legal tradition where justice blurred into spectacle and anything or nothing could be found guilty. What linked these cases to shadow trials was more than just absurdity. Medieval courts operated on a principle modern minds struggle to grasp. Everything had agency. A plague rat, a crumbling wall, even a gust of wind could be held responsible if it caused harm. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a way to restore balance. When a mill wheel killed a worker, prosecuting the wheel, often by dismantling it, gave the community closure. The logic was circular but comforting. If misfortune had a culprit, then misfortune could be controlled. The parallels to shadow trials are uncanny. Just as darkness was blamed for ruined harvests, animals bore the brunt of human fears. In 1628, a German town put a donkey on trial for consorting with witches after it brayed during a sermon. Witnesses testified the animal had demonic eyes, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Like shadows, animals couldn't defend themselves, but their silence only made them seem more guilty. The real crime wasn't the donkey's behavior, it was the community's terror of the unknown. Objects, too, fell prey to this legal theater. In 1532, a French vineyard accused a neighboring farmer's plow of blighting their grapes with its shadow. Sound familiar? The plow was banished from the field, a verdict eerily similar to shadow banishments. Even corpses faced judgment. In 1493, the exhumed body of a nobleman was put on trial for treason, complete with a defense attorney. When the rotting corpse refused to speak, it was declared guilty and thrown in a ditch. These trials weren't about justice, they were about power. By condemning the already powerless, whether shadows, animals, or objects, authorities could perform order without risking rebellion. Yet these absurdities reveal a profound truth about medieval society. In a world without science to explain disasters, blame needed a target. A shadow cursing a well was no weirder than a rat plotting plague. Both were attempts to make chaos feel intentional because intentional evil can be punished, while random tragedy cannot. The real difference: shadows were the perfect scapegoat. You couldn't hang every rat or banish every storm, but you could whitewash a wall and declare its shadow defeated. The theater of justice demanded a villain, and darkness always played the part. What's chilling is how these trials mirror modern scapegoating. Replace shadow with foreigner or plague rat with minority, and the pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. The medieval world may have prosecuted the absurd, but their impulse to blame the voiceless for society's ills never really disappeared. The courtrooms changed. The defendants didn't. Artistic depictions of shadow trials reveal just how deeply this bizarre legal spectacle seeped into the kingdom's culture, and how uneasily laughter mixed with fear. One particularly striking tapestry from 1522, the condemnation of the Duke's shadow, shows a row of black-robed judges pointing sternly at an empty patch of floor, their faces lit by candles that cast, ironically, even more shadows across the scene. The artist's genius lies in the details: a scribe dutifully recording the proceedings, a bailiff holding chains meant for a defendant that isn't there, and a crowd of onlookers whose expressions range from awe to barely suppressed giggles. It's a masterclass in satire, but also a chilling document of complicity. Every thread in the tapestry asks the same silent question: how could anyone take this seriously? And yet they did. Painters of the era walked a tightrope between mockery and morbid fascination. In the Trial of the Noon Shadow by Lawrence the Elder, sunlight streams through a courthouse window, illuminating the spot where the accused shadow should be, except it's conspicuously absent at high noon. The judges, oblivious, debate the shadow's crimes, while their own elongated silhouettes stretch across the floor like accusatory fingers. The message is sly but cutting. Those who judged darkness were blind to their own. Other works leaned into pure absurdity. A now lost fresco from the Abbey of St. Cerid reportedly showed a shadow confessing its sins to a priest, with the shadow's mouth represented by a carefully placed hole in the plaster where a draft made the candle flicker, as if speaking. Yet not all depictions were satirical. Some artists treated the trials with unsettling sincerity. A series of illuminated manuscripts from the Royal Archives show shadows as twisted, clawed creatures lurking at the edges of paintings, their crimes described in gilded text. In one, a shadow strangles a sleeping knight by merely lying across his throat. In another, a cluster of shadows conspire in a cellar, their forms blending into a single monstrous shape. These images weren't just art, they were propaganda, reinforcing the idea that shadows were tangible threats. For every painter who winked at the absurdity, another stoked the fear that kept the trials alive. The most haunting works, though, are the ones that blurred the line between ridicule and reverence. A set of woodcuts from the workshop of Hans Glimmermann shows a shadow trial in progress, but with a twist. The accused shadow is the only figure rendered in perfect realism, while the judges and witnesses are drawn as crude, almost grotesque caricatures. The effect is jarring, as if the artist is saying the shadow was the only honest thing in the room. Meanwhile, in the margins of church hymnals, anonymous doodles reveal quieter dissent, sketches of judges chasing their own shadows, or courtroom scenes where the real monster is the mob's frenzy, not the darkness they feared. These artworks do more than document a strange historical quirk. They expose the psychology of an era. The way a society depicts its fears reveals what it can't say aloud. In lavish tapestries and hurried sketches alike, the shadow trials became a mirror, one that reflected not just the absurdity of prosecuting darkness, but the deeper absurdity of any system where authority outweighs reason. The paintings outlasted the trials themselves, preserving a warning as timeless as the shadows they portrayed. When justice becomes theater, everyone plays a part, even if they're just laughing in the dark. The shadow trials of medieval Europe didn't just haunt courtrooms, they slithered into the pages of literature, morphing from legal absurdity into something darker and stranger. Gothic novelists, those masters of creeping dread, seized on the idea of prosecuting darkness. In Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, written in 1794, there's a chilling scene where a servant accuses a castle's shadows of conspiring to hide a murder. The language mirrors the trial records of the kingdom almost verbatim. Shadows lurk with intent, flee guiltily from candlelight. Radcliffe didn't invent this terror. She borrowed it from history, sharpening it into fiction. But no writer captured the surreal horror of shadow trials quite like Franz Kafka. His unfinished novel, The Trial, where Joseph K. is prosecuted by an opaque court for unspecified crimes, reads like a direct descendant of those medieval farces. Kafka's genius was inverting the premise. If the kingdom tried shadows as people, he put people on trial as shadows, faceless, voiceless, crushed by systems they couldn't understand. The bureaucratic nightmare of the trial mirrors the absurd logic of shadow courts, where guilt was assumed, evidence was meaningless, and the accused had no recourse. Kafka's unseen judges might as well have been sentencing silhouettes, yet the most unsettling adaptations weren't in novels at all, they were in folktales. The brothers Grimm collected a story called The Shadow's Revenge, where a condemned shadow returns to arrest the judge who sentenced it, stretching across his bedchamber like a noose. Here the moral was clear: fear turned outward always circles back. Even Hans Christian Andersen's The Shadow plays with the theme, though with a twist. The shadow isn't the villain, but a metaphor for the monstrous price of denying one's own darkness. What makes these literary echoes so potent is how they blur history into horror. The kingdom's trials were already surreal. Fiction simply peeled back their skin to show the grotesque bones beneath. When Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, she tapped into the same terror of the unseen. Her monster, like a shadow, is cobbled together from fragments of fear, then hunted for crimes it didn't choose. Bram Stoker's Dracula 2 draws power from this legacy. The vampire's lack of a reflection or shadow isn't just folklore. It's a sly nod to the idea that darkness, once condemned, might refuse to be bound by human laws. The shadow trials didn't just inspire stories, they became a blueprint for how we write about injustice. From the faceless accusers in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery to the spectral courts in Haruki Murakami's Kafka on the Shore, the idea of prosecuting the intangible lingers like a half-remembered nightmare. Literature's greatest trick was revealing the truth the kingdom refused to see. When you put shadows on trial, you're not judging darkness, you're confessing your own. Centuries after the last shadow was banished from a medieval courtroom, humanity still struggles with the same fundamental question: how do you prosecute what you can't touch? Today's courtrooms might not entertain cases against darkness, but they're wrestling with defendants just as elusive, algorithms that discriminate, deepfake videos that slander, and AI chatbots that defame. In 2023, a Colombian judge made headlines by ruling that an AI-generated avatar had legal personhood rights, a decision that would have made the kingdom's shadow judges nod in grim recognition. The parallels are uncanny. Just as medieval courts projected human motives onto shadows, modern laws strain to fit digital phantoms into frameworks built for flesh and blood. Take the case of a self-driving car that killed a pedestrian in 2018. Prosecutors faced the same existential dilemma as those medieval bailiffs dragging canvas, shadows into court. Who or what do you blame when there's no conscious intent? The car's AI wasn't a person, but it wasn't just a tool either. Like shadows accused of tripping villagers, it existed in a legal gray zone where old rules crumbled. Some argued the AI's code should be treated like a criminal mind dissected for malicious flaws. Others, echoing Friar Matthias's heresy centuries prior, insisted you can't punish what doesn't have a soul. The case settled quietly, leaving the question unresolved, but the precedent lingers like a ghost in the machine. Even more surreal are the battles over digital avatars in virtual worlds. When a user's likeness was stolen to create a non-consensual avatar in a popular metaverse platform, the lawsuit didn't target the hacker. It targeted the digital doppelganger itself. Court filings referred to the avatar as a fraudulent entity, demanding its deletion as if it were a medieval shadow sentenced to banishment. The judge's ruling danced around the issue, ordering the platform to prevent the avatar's reappearance without quite admitting it had ever been alive. It was a 21st century version of whitewashing a wall to purge its shadow, symbolic justice for an intangible harm. What connects these cases to the shadow trials isn't just absurdity, it's the human need to personify the unfamiliar. Medieval peasants saw malice in shifting darkness. We see it in glitching code. Both eras reveal law's greatest weakness, its inability to admit when something defies categorization. A 14th century judge couldn't say, shadows are just physics, any more than a modern one can say, AI has no will. To do so would unravel the illusion that every harm has a punishable cause. Yet there's a crucial difference. Where the kingdom's trials reinforced fear, today's debates, for all their clumsiness, are groping toward something new. When the European Union proposed granting electronic personhood to advanced AI, they weren't indulging superstition. They were acknowledging that old legal binaries, person/object, guilty/innocent, might need rethinking. Its progress, however messy, the shadow trials asked, how do we control what we don't understand? Modern courts are daring to ask, should we? Perhaps that's the real legacy of those medieval farces. They remind us that law isn't just about justice, it's about the stories we tell to make chaos feel ordered. Whether the defendant is a shadow, an algorithm, or a viral deepfake, the challenge remains the same: how to judge the invisible without becoming prisoners of our own fear. 500 years from now, will our AI prosecutions seem as ludicrous as trying darkness? The answer, like a shadow at noon, depends entirely on where you stand. Archaeologists digging through the ruins of the kingdom's old courthouses didn't expect to find proof of shadow trials until they unearthed a lead seal from 1406 stamped with a chilling inscription: "Judgment rendered against the shadow of the accused." This wasn't some forgotten metaphor. The seal, still clinging to a brittle parchment listing crimes of darkness, was attached to a verdict ordering a nobleman's shadow to be confined to dusk for a year. Nearby, excavators found something even stranger: iron brackets bolted to courtroom walls, their purpose unclear until a historian realized they matched descriptions of shadow cages, devices used to symbolically trap a shadow during trials by stretching black cloth across them. These weren't just superstitions scribbled in manuscripts. They were physical rituals baked into the very infrastructure of justice. But the most telling evidence isn't in artifacts, it's in the buildings themselves. The great courthouse of Brinthar, restored in the 1960s, reveals architectural quirks that make no sense until you consider shadow trials. Its windows are positioned at precise angles to minimize midday shadows in the courtroom, while the judge's bench sits atop a raised dais not for authority, but to ensure his shadow never contaminated the proceedings. Even the floor tells a story. Grooves cut into the stone suggest movable screens were once used to corral shadows during trials, like invisible defendants penned in a dock. Then there are the confessionals. In the basement of the Larkspur courthouse, archaeologists uncovered small, windowless chambers with one chilling feature: a single candle holder mounted at knee height, casting light upward. Church records confirm these weren't for human prisoners, but for shadows awaiting judgment. Accused shadows were interrogated by priests who documented their movements, read flickers as evidence of guilt. A ledger from 1512 details how one shadow refused to hold still under questioning, a damning sign of its rebellious nature. The sheer craftsmanship of these objects and spaces exposes how deeply the trials penetrated society. Shadow cages weren't crude props, they were forged by skilled blacksmiths, their hinges finely wrought as if holding something precious. Courtroom screens were carved with religious motifs, blurring the line between legal tool and sacred relic. This wasn't backyard superstition, it was institutionalized delusion, funded by the crown and blessed by the church. Yet the most haunting find came from a village outside Marisport. A child's wooden doll, its face painted white with a small black cloth stitched to its feet. Local historians believe it was a teaching tool used to show children how shadows acted independently from their owners. Generations grew up learning that darkness wasn't just absence, it was agency. When even toys reinforced the idea that shadows could betray you, is it any wonder the trials endured? These fragments of the past force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The kingdom didn't just believe in shadow trials, it built them into the world. Every lead seal, every skewed window, every candle holder in a dark room was a brick in an invisible prison, one that held not shadows but the minds of those who feared them. Archaeology usually uncovers what people left behind. Here, it reveals what they couldn't escape. Centuries after the last shadow was sentenced to symbolic banishment, a curious thing happened. Those long-forgotten trials clawed their way back into the light. Not as law, but as performance. Across Europe and America, neo-pagan groups and historical reenactors now stage mock shadow trials, complete with costumed judges and scripted testimony from actors swearing they've been wronged by darkness. The audience isn't there out of fear, of course. They come for the thrill of stepping into a world where logic was upside down, where the unimaginable became courtroom routine. What's fascinating isn't just that these reenactments exist, it's why they resonate. For neo-pagans, the trials are a gateway to ancestral mindsets, a way to touch the superstitions that once shaped daily life. A coven in Germany's Black Forest stages an annual trial of the harvest shadow, where participants debate whether a stretched silhouette stole the season's first apples. It's not belief, it's ritual theater, a chance to inhabit the fears of those who came before. As one organizer puts it, we're not prosecuting shadows, we're prosecuting our own distance from the past. Historians, meanwhile, use reenactments as a teaching tool. At the University of Edinburgh, students in a medieval law course stage shadow trials to understand how legal systems absorb collective panic. Watching a classmate solemnly argue that a patch of dusk cursed their inkwell drives home how easily authority can legitimize the absurd. The lesson isn't about shadows, it's about the fragility of justice when fear holds the gavel. But let's be honest, part of the appeal is pure macabre entertainment. A traveling troupe in France turned the trials into a comedy show with a shadow, played by a mischievous actor in black, escaping sentencing by mimicking the judge's movements. The crowd roars as the flustered magistrate trips over his own feet, suddenly aware of his silhouette's crimes. It's satire with a sting, laughing at the past while recognizing its echoes in modern scapegoating. Yet beneath the laughter and leather-bound theatrics, these reenactments expose something deeper. When we mock the trials, we're really wrestling with our own capacity for delusion. However ridiculous the idea of prosecuting shadows seems, it's uncomfortably human to blame the intangible, whether it's a medieval silhouette or a modern algorithm. The trials endure not as history, but as a mirror, and sometimes the most unsettling thing a mirror shows you isn't how far we've come, but how little the shadows have changed. Dr. Elena Voss, a historian of medieval law at Cambridge, leans over a crumbling court ledger from 1421, her finger tracing a verdict that reads, "The shadow, being of malicious disposition, is hereby banished from sunrise to sunset." What fascinates me, she says, isn't the absurdity, it's the bureaucracy. These weren't backroom superstitions. Scribes recorded every word, judges cited precedents, and bailiffs enforced sentences against empty air. The system wasn't broken, it worked perfectly just for a reality that never existed. Her research reveals how medieval courts bent logic without breaking it. When a shadow was accused of haunting a bridge, the court didn't dismiss the case, they debated whether the bridge's curvature made the shadow more liable to linger. It's a chilling glimpse of how institutions can rationalize collective delusion. Across the Atlantic, Professor Javier Morales of Columbia University sees eerie modern parallels. "We laugh at prosecuting shadows," he notes, "until you realize we still personify intangible threats." Medieval courts blamed shadows for crop failures. Today, algorithms get accused of bias as if they have intent. The language changes, the instinct doesn't. He points to a 2021 lawsuit where a streaming platform's recommendation AI was called negligent for suggesting violent videos, a case that, like shadow trials, grappled with punishing something without a mind. The difference, Morales adds, we at least recognize the algorithm isn't evil. Medieval courts truly believed shadows schemed. Meanwhile, Dr. Hannah al-Sharif, a cultural anthropologist based in Cairo, studies how shadow trials spread beyond Europe. In Persia, there are accounts of mirror trials where reflections were prosecuted for lying about a person's appearance, she explains. In West Africa, some traditions held that a person's shadow could testify against them in spirit courts. What unites these practices, al-Sharif argues, is the human need to externalize guilt. Shadows and reflections can't defend themselves, they're perfect scapegoats. When a society can't admit its own flaws, it invents silent defendants. Back in Oxford, Professor Richard Thorne takes a darker view. We focus on the comedy of trials without defendants, he says, but forget these were still acts of violence. He cites a case from 1498 where a woman was burned as a witch after her shadow failed to bleed when stabbed during its trial. The shadow was the pretext, but the victim was real. Sound familiar? Thorne draws a direct line to modern witch hunts, from McCarthyism to online cancel culture. The method evolves towering tweets, but the mechanism's the same. Invent a proxy for evil, then let the crowd do the rest. Yet perhaps the most unsettling insight comes from Dr. Leela Chen, who studies the neuroscience of belief. Brain scans show that when people anthropomorphize objects or shadows, their prefrontal cortex quiets down. Fear overrides critical thinking, she explains. Now imagine that on a societal scale, enforced by courts. It wasn't just ignorance, it was institutionalized cognitive distortion. Her studies of conspiracy theorists and medieval trial records reveal identical patterns. The more formal the process, the more plausible the absurdity becomes. Ritual legitimizes. If you dress madness in robes, it speaks with authority. What these scholars agree on is this: shadow trials weren't an anomaly. They were the logical endpoint of any system that prioritizes control over truth. The real lesson isn't how silly the past was, it's how thin the line remains between justice and collective fantasy. As Dr. Voss closes the ledger, she offers a wry smile. We like to think we're too advanced for shadow trials, but ask yourself, what's the next darkness we'll drag into court? The silence that follows isn't just pause for thought, it's the sound of history's echo waiting to be heard. Podcasts have seized on shadow trials with the fervor of medieval prosecutors chasing darkness. Take Law, Aaron Monk's hit supernatural history show, which devoted an entire episode to the kingdom's legal farces. His retelling lingers on the absurdity, judges debating whether a shadow fled the courtroom or merely retreated, but also taps into something deeper, the primal fear of the unseen. Other podcasts twist the trials into horror. The Magnus Archives featured a shadow that ate courtroom spectators, their screams muffled as darkness swallowed them whole. It's fiction, of course, but the terror feels familiar because it borrows from history's blueprint, the idea that shadows aren't just absence, but hunger. Television, too, can't resist the eerie drama of prosecuting darkness. The Netflix series The Witcher reimagines shadow trials in its haunting episode, A Grain of Truth, where a cursed man's silhouette moves independently, confessing to crimes he doesn't remember. The show's genius lies in flipping the script here. The shadow isn't the villain, but a victim of human cruelty. Even children's media plays with the concept. Hilda, the whimsical animated series, features a courtroom where clouds are put on trial for unlicensed rain. The tone is playful, but the satire cuts deep. When authority decides to blame the intangible, anything can be guilty. Documentaries take a subtler approach. BBC's Shadow of the Law juxtaposes medieval trial reenactments with modern psychological experiments. showing how easily people still attribute malice to random patterns. In one chilling segment, participants watch a shadow flicker on a wall and instinctively describe it as sneaky or angry. The film's thesis, the kingdom's trials weren't an anomaly, they were human nature amplified by fear. But perhaps the most intriguing adaptations are in video games. Disco Elysium, a critically acclaimed RPG, lets players interrogate a suspect's shadow in a drug-induced hallucination. The shadow confesses in riddles, forcing the player to confront their own biases. Meanwhile, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter hides a secret subplot where a farmer's shadow is arrested for blighting crops, a direct nod to historical records. These games don't just recount shadow trials, they make players complicit in their logic. What unites all these retellings is their focus on the trial's theatricality. Whether framed as horror, satire, or social commentary, modern media recognizes that prosecuting shadows was never about justice, it was about performance. The courtroom became a stage where societies acted out their deepest fears, and today's storytellers are still drawn to that dark spotlight. The difference. Now, we're not the ones holding the gavel. We're the audience, laughing, shuddering, and maybe, just maybe, recognizing our own reflections in the shadows we once condemned. Not every flicker of darkness in the kingdom's history ended up in the dock, despite popular retellings that paint medieval Europe as a place where every silhouette was suspect. Sorting fact from folklore reveals a more nuanced reality. Take the infamous Shadow of the Broken Tower trial. While court records confirm its existence, later chronicles exaggerated details, claiming the shadow shrieked when sentenced or that it bled black ink when pierced with a silver dagger. These embellishments, added centuries after the trial, reflect Victorian-era Gothic fascination more than medieval belief. Historians like Dr. Miriam Rothschild note that many shadow trial anecdotes circulating today stem from 19th century sensationalist histories, where writers jazzed up dry legal records with melodramatic flourishes. The kingdom's courts did prosecute shadows, but selectively. Surviving manuscripts show these trials peaked during specific crises, famine years, plague outbreaks, or political unrest. In calmer times, judges dismissed shadow accusations as foolishness, with one 14th century magistrate scribbling in the margins of a case, "If we try every patch of shade, we'll have no time for real thieves." This inconsistency exposes a truth often glossed over. Medieval people weren't uniformly superstitious. Skepticism existed alongside belief, sometimes in the same person. A merchant might laugh at shadow trials one day, then demand his neighbor's shadow be bound after his barn burned down the next. Fear, not logic, dictated when darkness became a defendant. Even the most well-documented cases get misrepresented. The trial of Lord Aldrich's shadow, often cited as proof of the kingdom's madness, was actually an outlier, a political stunt disguised as justice. Contemporary letters reveal Aldrich's rivals engineered the trial to humiliate him, bribing witnesses to swear his shadow moved treasonously. The real crime wasn't in the shadows, it was in the human hearts weaponizing them. Modern retellings strip this context away, turning a calculated power play into a quaint superstition. Then there are the outright fabrications. No evidence supports the oft-repeated tale of a shadow rebellion, where townsfolk supposedly burned down courthouses to free wrongfully convicted darkness. This myth, likely born from a satirical play in the 1700s, gets recycled as historical fact. Similarly, the idea that shadows were routinely executed by burning or dismembering their human counterparts is exaggerated. Most sentences were symbolic banishment from sunlight. imprisonment behind whitewashed walls because even medieval judges balked at harming people for their silhouettes. Why does this matter? Because reducing the past to caricature robs us of its lessons. The kingdom's shadow trials weren't a monolithic madness. They were a spectrum of belief, manipulation, and occasional absurdity. Some trials reflected genuine terror of the unseen. Others were power grabs dressed in superstitions robes, and many never happened at all. They're just shadows cast by later imaginations onto history's wall. Recognizing this complexity doesn't make the truth less strange, it makes it human. After all, the line between fact and folklore isn't always clear-cut sometimes, it's just a trick of the light. The shadow trials of medieval Europe may seem like relics of a distant, superstitious past, but their legacy lingers in ways we rarely acknowledge. At their core, these trials weren't really about shadows. They were about fear's power to warp reality, to turn the inexplicable into something punishable. And that instinct to blame the intangible for our misfortunes hasn't disappeared. It's just traded black robes for hashtags and courtroom decrees for viral outrage. Consider modern moral panics, the way entire communities rally against imagined threats, from satanic cults hiding in heavy metal lyrics to baseless conspiracy theories about vaccines or elections. The players change, but the script stays eerily familiar. A shadow blamed for a failed harvest becomes a shadowy cabal accused of controlling the world. The mechanism is identical. Fear demands a villain, and when none exists, we invent one. History's darkest chapters often begin with this kind of collective delusion. The Salem witch trials didn't start with fire and nooses. They started with whispers about women who moved strangely or cast long shadows. Sound familiar? The kingdom's courts prosecuted darkness for crimes no one could prove, just as social media mobs today condemn strangers based on rumors that feel true. In both cases, the absence of evidence isn't a problem, it's the point. When fear fuels justice, the accused's silence becomes proof of guilt. A shadow can't speak in its defense. Neither can a meme, a rumor, or a pixelated face on a screen. Yet there's a crucial difference. Medieval courts at least acknowledged their trials as theater, however unconsciously. The verdicts were symbolic, banishing shadows to dusk or whitewashing walls because deep down, even the judges knew they couldn't truly punish darkness. Modern moral panics lack that restraint. When we cancel a person or idea, the consequences are anything but symbolic. Careers evaporate, lives fracture. The irony, we pride ourselves on rationality while repeating history's mistakes with higher stakes and wider reach. The lesson of the shadow trials isn't that our ancestors were gullible. It's that fear, once institutionalized, resists reason. The kingdom didn't stop prosecuting shadows because people grew smarter. They stopped when the cost of belief outweighed the comfort. Today, we face the same reckoning. Every time we blame algorithms for radicalizing people instead of examining the alienation that fuels extremism, every time we treat complex issues as battles between pure good and pure evil, we're rebuilding those medieval courtrooms in digital form. But here's the hopeful twist. Unlike the kingdom, we have the tools to recognize these patterns. Psychology maps how fear distorts perception. History documents the damage done when societies scapegoat the unseen. The shadow trials remind us that progress isn't about eliminating fear. It's about refusing to let it write the laws. Darkness, after all, isn't the enemy. It's just what happens when we turn away from the light. If a shadow could be guilty, where did responsibility truly lie? This wasn't just a legal puzzle for medieval courts, it was a philosophical earthquake. The kingdom's judges operated on a belief that shadows possessed agency. the capacity to act independently, like a rogue servant or a stray arrow. But this raised a haunting question. If a shadow chose to commit crimes, did its owner share the blame? Court records from 1392 reveal a noblewoman fined for her shadow's lewd behavior after it stretched suggestively across a priest's robe during Mass. The verdict argued that while the shadow acted alone, its corruption reflected poorly on the woman's soul. Here, morality wasn't just about actions, it was about proximity to darkness, literally and figuratively. Modern ethics would dismiss this as absurd. Shadows can't choose anything, but medieval thinkers saw the world through a lens of participatory guilt, where everything connected to sin bore its stain. A priest's sermon from 1408 compared shadows to the devil's fingerprints, arguing that just as a criminal's knife was burned with his body, a shadow's crimes tainted its caster. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a coherent, if flawed, system of accountability. If God held the entire world morally responsible, from floods to famines, why wouldn't humans extend that logic to their own silhouettes? Yet the trials exposed a paradox. By prosecuting shadows, the courts inadvertently absolved humans of blame. A farmer whose shadow blighted a neighbor's crops faced no punishment himself, only his shadow was banished. This loophole became a perverse kind of safety valve. Wealthy landowners exploited it, redirecting accusations toward their own darkness to avoid repercussions. A merchant in Ravensbrück even confessed his shadow's theft of guild secrets, knowing the punishment would be symbolic. The system designed to purify morality became a tool for evading it. The clash between medieval and modern ethics hinges on intent. Today, we punish actions rooted in conscious decisions, a murderer's choice, a thief's plan. But in a world where intent could be projected onto the intangible, justice became untethered from reality. The kingdom's courts didn't just misunderstand shadows, they redefined sin itself, decoupling it from human will. In doing so, they created a world where darkness could be evil, but the people casting it, strangely, blameless. The trials weren't just prosecuting shadows. They were exposing how easily accountability dissolves when fear draws the lines. Nursery rhymes and bedtime stories often hold hidden histories, whispers of darker times repackaged for tender ears. The kingdom's shadow trials didn't vanish when the courts abandoned them. They slithered into children's tales, their terror sanded down into whimsy. Take the lullaby "Hush, the Shadow's Sleeping," still sung in some European villages. The original lyrics, dug up from a 15th century manuscript, warned of a shadow that crept and crawled and stole the moon's bright face. Modern versions turn it into a gentle ditty about a mischievous silhouette hiding toys, but the older words tell a different story, one where darkness was a thief to be tried and sentenced. Then there's The Cobbler and His Shadow, a fable about a shoemaker whose shadow ran away to commit crimes, leaving the poor man to prove his innocence. On the surface, it's a lesson about honesty, but the tale's roots are murkier. Historians trace it to a real 16th century case where a cobbler's shadow was accused of tracking mud into a noble's house. The story's happy ending, the shadow returning, sorry and clean, softens the horror of a time when even children knew shadows could be dragged to court. Even classic fairy tales bear the imprint of these trials. In an early draft of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf's shadow is described as long and guilty, slinking ahead of him like an accomplice. Later versions cut the detail, but the motif lingers in illustrations where the wolf's silhouette seems sharper, more menacing than his form. The brothers Grimm collected a now obscure tale called The Girl Who Lost Her Shadow, where a child's missing silhouette is put on trial by woodland creatures for abandoning its duty. The verdict: the shadow must serve penance by clinging tighter to its owner forever, an eerie echo of the kingdom's judicial logic. What's fascinating isn't just how these stories sanitized history, but why. Turning shadow trials into nursery rhymes served a dual purpose. It made the past digestible for children while subtly reinforcing societal norms. A lullaby about a naughty shadow taught obedience. A fable about a runaway silhouette warned against straying too far from watchful eyes. The tales transformed legal absurdities into moral lessons, scrubbing away the fear but keeping the control. Yet sometimes the darkness bleeds through. In the Swiss folktale, The Midnight Court, children recite a rhyme while jumping over their shadows. Step light, step bright, or the judges will come tonight. It's played as a game now, but the original context was anything but playful. A reference to nocturnal, shadow inspections, where villagers believed magistrates roamed after dark, checking for disobedient shadows that moved without their owners. The rhyme was a warning. Generations later, the threat is gone, but the chill remains tucked between the sing-song verses. These stories endure because they're more than just echoes of the past. They're proof of how societies metabolize their own fears, turning terror into tradition and trials into tales. The kingdom's courts may have faded, but in the quiet of a child's bedroom, the shadows still whisper, not as defendants, but as something stranger, bedtime monsters shaped by history. Imagine a treasurer's ledger from 1403, its pages crammed with entries for candle wax, whitewash, and most baffling of all, salaries for shadow guards. The kingdom's obsession with prosecuting darkness wasn't just legally absurd, it was financially ruinous. Every trial required real money from real coffers. Judges who spent weeks debating the movements of silhouettes needed their wages. Bailiffs tasked with escorting shadows to court demanded hazard pay for handling volatile darkness. Even the ink used to record verdicts against empty air had to be purchased, line by line, at a scribe's going rate. The sheer mundanity of these expenses, receipts for chains never used, iron cages built to hold nothing, reveals the true cost of collective delusion. Take the infamous Great Shadow Purge of 1397, when the city of Larkspur declared all shadows cast by its western gate enemies of the crown. Officials employed 12 laborers for a month to whitewash the entire gatehouse, inside and out, ensuring no darkness could take refuge in its corners. The cost equivalent to feeding 200 peasants for a year. Meanwhile, the Diocese of Ravensbrück maintained a full-time exorcist of shadows, complete with a stipend for holy chalk to draw containment circles. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were budget line items draining resources that could have fortified crumbling walls or stocked granaries. The most surreal expenses, though, were the shadow taxes. Villages near dense forests where lingering dusk made shadows more persistent paid levies to fund additional trials. In one record from 1289, farmers in Briarwood protested being charged extra because their valley's long sunsets produced overly ambitious shadows that lingered past curfew. The Crown's solution, a sliding scale. The longer a shadow stayed visible after sundown, the higher its owner's tax bracket. It was bureaucracy meets boogeyman logic, a financial incentive to fear the inevitable. Yet the greatest economic irony lay in the shadow trade. Entrepreneurs quickly realized that if darkness could be criminalized, it could also be commodified. Certified shadow-free, merchants sold mirrors and lanterns at inflated prices, promising to dispel guilt by association. Cunning innkeepers near courthouses rented shadow-proof rooms to defendants, hoping to starve their accused silhouettes of evidence. Even the church profited, selling blessed tapers guaranteed to cast pious shadows that wouldn't attract legal scrutiny. The trials didn't just drain wealth, they created a black market for innocence in literal black and white. What's startling isn't that the kingdom wasted money on shadow trials, but how stubbornly it kept funding them despite the absurdity. When a treasurer in 1421 dared to question the costs, his colleagues accused his shadow of embezzling sunlight. The ledgers tell the real story. Fear wasn't just a cultural force, it was a fiscal one. Every coin spent chasing darkness was a coin not spent feeding the hungry or healing the sick. The trials didn't just fail to deliver justice, they bankrupted the very idea of it. The kingdom that believed shadows could be arrested wasn't alone in putting the unseen on trial. It was part of a much darker, global tradition where cultures prosecuted what they couldn't touch. In Japan, villagers held ceremonies to banish yokai, invisible spirits blamed for everything from spoiled milk to vanishing children. Unlike shadows, yokai had names and personalities. A mischievous baked tanuki might be sentenced to exile by shrine priests, while a vengeful yurei could be bound with sacred ropes. But the principle was the same, giving form to fear through ritual. Even today, towns like Tono preserve yokai courts, reenacting trials where straw effigies stand in for the accused spirits, their verdicts sealing away misfortune like medieval whitewash sealing shadows. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, Norse sagas tell of Thingsted's open-air courts where ghosts were summoned to answer for hauntings. The dead, like shadows, couldn't speak in their own defense, so villagers interpreted creaks in the floorboards or gusts of wind as spectral testimony. A 12th century Icelandic manuscript describes a trial where a ghost was found guilty of chilling the hearth and sentenced to wander the glacier until the sun melted him. The parallels to shadow trials are uncanny. Both substituted symbolism for justice, turning the intangible into something that could be banished or broken. Africa's traditions took this further. Among the Zulu, Umnyama, the darkness of evil omens wasn't just feared, it was ritually cleansed through communal ceremonies akin to sentencing. In one documented case from the 19th century, a shadow cast by a lightning-struck tree was tried by elders for bringing bad luck, its punishment being the tree's uprooting. Half a world away, the Aztecs prosecuted tonally, the shadow-like soul fragments believed to cause illness if detached. Healers staged mock trials to reintegrate the tonally, blending medicine and judicial theater, much like the kingdom's courts mixed law and superstition. Europe, of course, had its own versions beyond shadows. In medieval France, animals, from pigs to locusts, faced execution for crimes. But the most chilling parallel came from Germany's witch shadows trials, where a woman's silhouette moving independently was proof of demonic pact. Unlike the kingdom's broad prosecutions, these trials targeted individuals, using their shadows as evidence of heresy. The twist: judges argued that since shadows were God's creation, a rebellious one must be the devil's work, a theological loophole that turned physics into heresy. What unites these traditions isn't just the absurdity of prosecuting the invisible, it's the shared human need to name the nameless. Whether a Japanese yokai, a Norse ghost, or a European shadow, cultures worldwide reached the same conclusion. If misfortune couldn't be explained, it could at least be convicted. The methods varied: banishment, binding, or symbolic destruction, but the purpose didn't. These trials were exorcisms by another name, rituals to restore order by punishing chaos itself. Yet the differences reveal just as much. In Japan, yokai trials often ended with offerings appeasing spirits rather than condemning them. In Scandinavia, ghost verdicts were about closure for the living, not justice for the dead. The kingdom's shadow trials stood out not for their uniqueness, but for their bureaucratic rigor. Other cultures used supernatural courts to soothe collective anxiety. The kingdom turned them into law. That distinction between ritual and statute is what made its shadow prosecutions so unsettling. They weren't just folklore, they were policy, dressed in the robes of justice and wielding the gavel of fear. The most haunting lesson lies in how these traditions faded. Yokai trials became festivals, ghost verdicts turned into folktales, shadow trials. They collapsed under their own weight when reason outgrew them. But the instinct to blame the unseen never disappeared. It just found new defendants. Today's viral outrage mobs and algorithmic scapegoats are the heirs to those medieval courts, still chasing shadows in the dark. The costumes change, the trials don't. Shadow trials might belong to the dusty pages of medieval history, but their echoes linger in ways we rarely stop to consider. It's easy to laugh at the idea of prosecuting darkness, but the real absurdity isn't in the trials themselves. It's in how little human nature has changed. Fear still twists logic into knots, and power still dresses its whims in the robes of justice. The difference? Our shadows wear new disguises. Algorithms, viral rumors, even abstract concepts like cancel culture or market forces now play the role of the silent defendant, blamed for outcomes too complex to pin on any one person. The courtroom has moved online, but the script remains eerily familiar. When chaos strikes, we still demand something or nothing to hold accountable. What made shadow trials so chilling wasn't their superstition, it was their sincerity. Judges didn't wink as they sentenced darkness, they truly believed they were purging evil. That unshakable conviction is the real warning. History's darkest chapters always begin with people convinced they're fighting phantoms. The Salem witch trials, McCarthy's Red Scare, even modern conspiracy theories all follow the same pattern. Fear conjures a villain, and reason takes a backseat. The kingdom's courts show us how easily institutions can codify delusion, turning collective panic into policy with a stroke of a pen. Yet there's hope in the absurdity. The trials didn't end because people suddenly became rational. They ended because the weight of their own nonsense grew too heavy. Every generation has its shadow trials, but every generation also has those who dare to point at the empty dock and ask, what are we really doing here? That's the lesson worth carrying forward. The next time society starts blaming the intangible, whether it's an algorithm, a rumor, or some other modern-day specter, we do well to remember the judges who once sentenced patches of dust. Fear loves a silent defendant. Justice demands a voice. So as we close this chapter, don't just chuckle at the past. Ask yourself, what shadows are we still chasing? What unseen forces do we blame to avoid harder truths? The best antidote to history's mistakes isn't smug hindsight, it's humility. The world's still full of mysteries, and not all of them are harmless. But the moment we start putting them on trial, we've already lost the plot. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most of all, stay willing to laugh at the darkness, especially when it's our own. Got a wild historical trial you think tops Shadow Court? Drop it in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the absurd, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a story where history gets stranger than fiction. Until next time, keep questioning the verdicts. After all, the truth is rarely black and white, but it's never just a shadow.